When drugs build empires, money builds kingdoms, and his kingdom was made of chemicals. Shanghai, China, a city of steel and smoke where the factories never sleep and the streets never rest. Millions of footsteps, thousands of faces, yet only a handful destined to leave a mark on the world. Among them was a boy named Zhenli Ye Gon. He wasn't born into a dynasty of power. He wasn't raised in violence or chaos. His childhood had no rifles, no gangs, no blood-soaked rituals of survival. His weapon was different. His inheritance was knowledge, formulas, the silent, invisible science of chemicals. From an early age, Ye Gon understood something that most around him did not. Power does not always announce itself with noise. Sometimes it hums in the background, hidden in the gears of industry, waiting to be harnessed. While others dreamed of escaping poverty through business or migration, Ye Gon studied the elements that no one paid attention to. Compounds, reactions, substances that could be turned into more than medicine. He learned that with chemistry, you could create not just cures but empires. In the 1990s, opportunity called. Mexico, a country where the state was fractured, where corruption bled through every institution, where cartels battled openly in the streets, was desperate for something. Supplies, connections, people who could bring what others could not. And into this storm walked Ye Gon. Not as a gangster, not as a killer. He wore no tattoos of allegiance. He carried no gun. He arrived as an importer, as a man of business. The paperwork was clean. Medicines, pills, powders, licenses, warehouses. Everything appeared legitimate, respectable. To the outside world, Ye Gon was just another foreign entrepreneur riding the global wave of trade. But beneath the stamped documents and customs clearances, something darker flowed. He wasn't simply moving medicine. He was opening a secret artery between continents. From the factories of Asia to the ports of Mexico, shipments came that carried far more than pharmaceuticals. They carried precursors, the chemicals needed to cook methamphetamine, the lifeblood of a new era of crime. While Mexican cartels murdered each other over street corners, while commanders argued over plazas, while gunmen died in the dust, Ye Gon stood apart. He was the man in the shadows, untouched, untouchable, because he wasn't chasing neighborhoods. He was chasing the supply chain itself. He knew the cartels were starving for raw material. He knew that without chemicals, there could be no meth, no profit, no empire. And he alone had the keys to that kingdom. He became the invisible supplier, the quiet merchant who fed the beasts. His business was not measured in bullets or bodies, but in containers and cargo ships. In factories that never stopped producing. In ports where inspectors were paid to look away. And with each shipment, he tightened his grip on an entire underworld. The genius of Ye Gon was that he did not have to announce himself. Cartel bosses did that for him. They whispered his name in boardrooms and jungle camps alike. They knew the truth. Guns can take a street, but chemicals can fuel a continent. Without him, meth production stalled. With him, it exploded. He didn't need an army to protect him. His army was demand. He didn't need blood on his hands. Others spilled it in his name. He didn't need to threaten. His power was quiet, unspoken, built into the very fabric of the product itself. And every cartel boss, from Sinaloa to Michoacan, understood one thing clearly. Without Zhenli Ye Gon, their empire would starve, because he wasn't just a businessman. He wasn't just an immigrant chasing fortune. He was the phantom merchant, the man who turned science into gold, chemistry into power, invisibility into dominance. While the world looked at gunmen and kingpins, he was the ghost behind the curtain, the figure in the lab coat who built empires without firing a single shot. And from Shanghai to Mexico City, from factories to fortified mansions, one lesson became clear. The most dangerous men are not always the loudest. Sometimes they're the ones who arrive with papers in hand, a smile on their face, and a container full of shadows. In Mexico City, the skyline hides secrets. Glass towers and colonial mansions stand beside sprawling warehouses, anonymous and gray. To most, they were just storage. To Zhenli Ye Gon, they were arteries of an empire. Inside, under fluorescent lights and locked doors, mountains of chemical drums stood stacked like soldiers, each one holding the future of entire cartels. Ships crossed the Pacific, leaving ports in Asia heavy with containers. They carried merchandise labeled as pharmaceuticals, industrial solvents, and lab supplies. On paper, everything checked out. Customs officers stamped the documents, cargo was unloaded, and trucks rolled inland. No alarms, no suspicion, just business as usual. Because Ye Gon's genius wasn't only in chemicals, it was in legitimacy. He didn't operate like a street dealer sneaking contraband under his coat. He operated like a corporation. His company, Unimed Pharmchem, had licenses, warehouses, employees, accountants. To regulators, he was a foreign entrepreneur investing in Mexico's pharmaceutical trade. To the cartels, he was the indispensable lifeline who fed their hunger for meth. Millions of pills entered the country disguised as medicine. Tons of pseudoephedrine and other precursors flowed in disguised as harmless imports. What looked like medicine on paper became poison in practice. The shipments arrived by the truckload, disappearing into secret labs scattered across Mexico's deserts, mountains, and safe houses. Politicians saw the shipments. Some pretended not to. Others smiled as envelopes changed hands. Corruption wasn't a flaw in the system. It was the system itself. Every bribe bought another blind eye, another signature, another green light. The higher the stacks of cash, the smoother the roads became. And those rivers of chemicals fed the monsters. Sinaloa cooked meth by the ton, sending it north across the US border. The Gulf Cartel turned labs into factories, churning out product for international markets. La Familia Michoacana, with its cult-like violence, became one of the most notorious meth producers in the country. All thanks to Ye Gon's supply chain. He didn't need to meet them in person. He didn't sit in smoke-filled rooms or jungles with men carrying rifles. His role was colder, more calculated. He was the supplier in the shadows. The man who never fired a shot, yet gave cartels the bullets they needed for a new kind of war. Everyone was buying. Everyone was cooking. And because of that, everyone was killing. Meth money bought weapons, bribed officials, funded massacres. Every container Ye Gon imported left a trail of corpses across Mexico. But in his world, he wore no bloodstains. He wore a suit. He sat in offices. He signed papers. That was his armor, legitimacy. While rival smugglers dodged bullets, Ye Gon hid behind contracts. While soldiers raided safe houses, his warehouses looked respectable. Even when suspicions rose, the sheer scale of his operation made it seem impossible that it was illegal. Who could believe that one man, behind one company, was fueling multiple cartels at once? Yet that was the truth. His empire wasn't measured in plazas controlled or assassinations ordered. It was measured in shipments cleared, warehouses filled, and chemicals dispersed. Where others needed armies, he needed only cargo ships. Where others fought in the streets, he fought in boardrooms. And still, at the heart of it all, was just one man. A quiet figure in tailored suits. A businessman to some, a phantom supplier to others. Invisible, yet indispensable. Because in the world of shadows, power isn't always about who holds the gun. Sometimes, it belongs to the one who delivers the powder. Mexico was already drowning in violence, but nothing prepared the world for what police would uncover inside a mansion in the wealthy district of Lomas de Chapultepec, Mexico City. This wasn't a battlefield. This wasn't a border town. It was the home of the rich, the powerful, the untouchable. And yet, behind its tall walls and elegant facade, hid the heart of an empire built not on bullets, but on chemicals. When the doors were forced open, silence met the raiding officers. No gunfire, no cartel soldiers in a last stand. Just room after room stacked with something far heavier than corpses. Cash, mountains of it. Stacks of US dollars piled floor to ceiling, taller than the men who found them. Neat, compressed bundles, wrapped in plastic, sealed in tape, each one worth more than a lifetime of honest work. As officers moved deeper into the house, they found bags of pesos stuffed into closets, boxes of jewels hidden in bedrooms, watches, gold, luxury items scattered like loose change. The final tally shocked the planet. $205 million in cash, the largest drug money seizure in history. Not in Colombia, not in some jungle bunker, but in the middle of Mexico's capital, inside a mansion owned by a man who didn't look like a kingpin at all. It wasn't just wealth, it was evidence, proof that one man, without an army, without control over plazas or sicarios, had managed to feed the deadliest industry on Earth. Proof that while cartels spilled rivers of blood to hold territory, Zhenli Ye Gon had simply held the supply line. That fortune wasn't built on extortion or kidnapping. It was built on shipments, on paperwork, on chemicals that fueled an entire generation of meth production. The raid ripped away the mask of legitimacy. The polished image of a pharmaceutical businessman collapsed overnight. Suddenly, the quiet man in a suit was revealed as the phantom merchant, the hidden supplier whose empire had been hiding in plain sight. For years, politicians, customs officials, and even rival traffickers had looked the other way, convinced he was untouchable. But the sight of $205 million in stacked bills erased all doubt. News spread like wildfire. Photographs of the cash piles flooded global headlines. The world stared in disbelief. Cartels had always been rich, but no one had ever seen wealth like this. It was obscene, a physical monument to corruption, greed, and blood money. And it told a story more powerful than any confession. You didn't need to hold a gun to be dangerous. You just needed to hold the chemicals. Zhenli Ye Gon knew the walls were closing in. As his empire crumbled, he chose flight over fight. He fled Mexico, slipping across the border into the United States, hoping that distance could buy him safety. But shadows only stay hidden in the dark. Once exposed, they can't return to invisibility. For years, he had been the phantom, the man who existed behind the curtains, controlling the flow of meth precursors without stepping into the spotlight. But after Lomas de Chapultepec, after the photographs of cash towers taller than men, after the headlines declaring the biggest drug cash seizure in history, there was no hiding left. The phantom had become visible, and once visible, he was vulnerable. When US authorities closed in, the illusion finally shattered. Zhenli Ye Gon, the quiet chemist who once fed cartels without firing a single shot, was in custody. No mansion walls, no corporate shields, no disguises. Just a man on the run who had finally been caught. And in that moment, the myth of invincibility died. The Empire of Shadows had been forced into the light. When Zhenli Ye Gon crossed into the United States, he believed distance would protect him. Mexico was on fire. His mansion was stripped bare. His fortune displayed to the world like evidence in a museum of crime. But in America, the man who had once been invisible was suddenly under a spotlight brighter than anything he had ever known. And instead of shadows to hide in, there were microphones, cameras, and prosecutors waiting. In courtrooms and interrogation rooms, Ye Gon painted himself as a victim. He claimed he had been forced to operate, coerced by corrupt Mexican officials who had demanded he warehouse the chemicals. He described himself not as a kingpin, but as a scapegoat, a businessman caught in a system far bigger than himself. He swore that the real criminals were politicians, generals, and men in high places who had used him as a pawn. And then came the words that would seal his infamy. If not, do it yourself. A defiant challenge he allegedly shouted at officials when pressed about his role. In Spanish, si no, háganlo ustedes mismos. It was a phrase that echoed across newspapers, broadcasts, and late-night comedy shows. What he intended as a defense turned into a punchline. His denial became a taunt, his explanation twisted into mockery. Overnight, the quiet chemist was no longer a phantom. He was a public spectacle, but the world wasn't laughing with him. The world was watching him unravel. For years, he had hidden behind paperwork, legitimacy, and corporate structures. Now he was forced to sit in court, shackled, no longer the untouchable supplier, but just another defendant. Prosecutors laid out the evidence, the warehouses, the imports, the $205 million mountain of cash. To jurors and to the public, no excuse could wash away the sheer scale of his empire. Unlike the cartel bosses he supplied, Ye Gon had no army to silence witnesses, no assassins to intimidate judges, no tunnels to dig beneath prison floors. His empire had been built on containers and chemicals, not on gunmen and blood. And without those tools of violence to shield him, he stood alone, exposed, vulnerable. The irony was brutal. The man who had never needed a gun, who had never spilled blood himself, now faced the same fate as the killers he had supplied. He wasn't treated like a businessman and over his head. He was treated like what he had become, the architect of an industry of death, the silent partner who had fueled Mexico's meth epidemic. Extradition became his reality. From America, he was sent back to Mexico to face trial. The mansion was gone, the cash seized, the jewels confiscated. The networks he once controlled abandoned him. Politicians who had smiled at him in private now swore they had never known him. The machine he once powered had spat him out. Inside prison walls, the silence was suffocating. No phones to make calls, no shipments to monitor, no papers to sign. Just steel bars and concrete floors. For a man who had built an empire out of invisibility, the loss of control was absolute. There were no more shadows to hide in. Only light, cold, and merciless, shining on what he truly was. And that was the final humiliation. He had been a chemist who turned compounds into gold, a businessman who outsmarted cartels, a phantom who built empires without ever firing a shot. But stripped of his fortune, his company, his influence, he was reduced to nothing more than another prisoner with a number instead of a name. No tunnels, no armies, no escape. Just silence. Today, Zhenli Ye Gon sits behind the cold walls of a Mexican prison. No laboratories, no warehouses humming with activity, no fleets of ships crossing the Pacific under his command. The mansion where officers discovered mountains of cash has long been stripped bare, its treasures seized, its secrets exposed. The empire he built from shadows is dismantled. The fortune he once flaunted in silence has disappeared into the evidence vaults of governments. To the world, it seems the story has ended. But the truth is more complicated. Because while Ye Gon may be locked away, the machinery he set in motion has never stopped. The chemicals still flow, the containers still cross oceans, the ports still receive shipments hidden in plain sight. Pseudoephedrine, ephedrine, and other precursors continue to find their way into clandestine labs across Mexico. And the meth still cooks, stronger, cheaper, and deadlier than ever before. The lesson left behind is chilling. Ye Gon was not just another trafficker who lived and died by the gun. He was not a warlord carving territory with armies of sicarios. He was something rarer, something far more dangerous. A man who understood that in the drug trade, power does not always come from violence. It can come from logistics, from supply chains, from chemicals. He was proof that an empire could be built not with bullets, but with formulas, contracts, and containers. Even in his absence, cartels have followed his blueprint. They no longer rely solely on Colombian suppliers or on small-scale labs hidden in remote mountains. They think bigger, industrial. They import at scale, manufacture at scale, and distribute at scale. They learned from Ye Gon that invisibility is not about hiding in jungles, but about hiding in legitimacy. Inside companies, warehouses, and ports, shielded by paperwork and corruption. For the Mexican state, his legacy is a bitter reminder of weakness. He thrived not because he was invincible, but because institutions were fragile. Customs officials waved shipments through. Politicians smiled and took envelopes. Police chiefs looked away. Judges hesitated. His empire grew in the cracks of a collapsing system, and those cracks are still there. Locking him up did not fix them. To the cartels, Ye Gon remains a ghostly teacher. They know his fortune was real, his capture humiliating, his trial infamous. But they also know the method works. They know that as long as precursors can enter the country, someone will step into the role he once held. He proved that one man, with no gunmen and no public face, could feed multiple cartels at once. He proved that the supplier can be more powerful than the trafficker, because he holds the keys to the very product itself. And so his legend persists, not in narco corridos sung in bars, not in whispered ballads of violence, but in boardrooms, ports, and warehouses. His name is remembered by traffickers, not as a warrior, but as a model, a supplier, a phantom who showed them how to make billions without ever firing a bullet. Today, Ye Gon may be silent, caged, forgotten by the public. But the system he exposed, the method he perfected, still thrives. Every shipment of chemicals arriving at a Mexican port carries an echo of his work. Every lab that churns out meth for American streets carries his shadow. Because Zhenli Ye Gon wasn't just a man. He was a lesson written in powder and cash. A reminder that in the underworld, some of the most dangerous kingpins never step onto battlefields, never command armies, never leave their fingerprints on a weapon. They hide in the paperwork. They hide in the shadows. They hide in plain sight. He didn't rule with blood. He ruled with powder. And in a war of cartels, that was enough.